Hello, welcome to the Unriveted podcast, where we talk about artificial intelligence, digital transformation, and people. Today, our podcast is brought to you by our book, AI in a Weekend, an Executive's Guide. And with that, let me lead into the intro by John of our guests. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Martin. So today we are joined with a special guest, Dmitri Alperovitch. So Dmitri is a leading expert in geopolitics and national security, the co-founder and executive chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. And then prior to founding Silverado, he also co-founded and served as the chief technology officer of CrowdStrike. Probably most importantly, and what we're going to be talking a little bit more about today, he is the author of World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Thank you very much, Dmitri, for joining us today on the podcast. And as I typically do, I only gave the cliff notes on your background, as Martin stated. So I like to turn it over to you and tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you are today, and anything else important that I might have left out in that little blurb there. And then
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Well, you got the cliff notes right. I spent my career, early parts of my career in the cybersecurity industry, co-founded CrowdStrike, now one of the largest cybersecurity companies in the world. But actually, throughout my career, I have been focused on national security, geopolitics, focused on China specifically for the last 14 years, very intently ever since I released a report on Operation Aurora, which was the hack of Google and many other companies from Chinese nation state actors all the way back in 2010. And really unveiled that what was happening against this country is economic warfare, that China was stealing everything that's not bolted down, and really perpetrating the greatest transfer of wealth in history, as I called it at the time. And now this book really is a culmination of all those efforts and focus, particularly in the last 4 years since I launched Silverado, to really articulate the threat that we're facing vis-a-vis China. I believe we're in a new Cold War, and one that has a good chance of becoming a hot war, unfortunately, in the next 4 to 8 years, because I do believe that China, and particularly Xi Jinping, is intent on taking Taiwan or trying to take Taiwan somewhere in the 2028 through 2032 period, which can bring us to the brink of a potentially nuclear conflict.
Wow. There's a lot to unravel and unpack here, Dimitri. And our audience is typically excited about areas that we focus on. And I want to stay in the softer side a little bit, but we'll touch into this. Or what do you think China has as far as an approach to innovation versus the U.S. today? And do you feel that we have a chance in the market with artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies versus China?
Well, I think we absolutely have a chance. So China's approach is pretty straightforward. Its approach is to emphasize resilience and independence in all strategic sectors. This is what Made in China 2025 plan that was unveiled back in 2015 by Xi Jinping is all about, is to basically reduce reliance on Western companies, and not only reduce reliance, but also dominate those sectors like semiconductors and aerospace and artificial intelligence and the like. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for them, they've not made a huge amount of progress in those key areas. They made some, but not as much as they would like. And it's clear that 2025 will be a failure and will probably become 2030 at some point. But in large part, it's been a failure because of our efforts to curtail them, particularly in their ambitions to produce advanced semiconductors and to import advanced GPUs that are necessary for training AI models. But the strategy is basically, from their perspective, is to essentially provide enormous subsidies, government subsidies, to their champions of industry, in fact, picking the winners in their sectors and then overtly investing in them in order to allow them to dump their products on our shores and really globally at reduced prices, drive competition out of business. That is to steal massive amounts of intellectual property to power their innovation engine. Back in 2011, I found myself in the Situation Room of the White House talking to national security officials about yet another Chinese espionage report that I had just put out, outlining how much they were stealing, and really getting animated in that I thought that what was being done against us, as I mentioned, is economic warfare, that something had to be done about that. And the response was, oh, Dmitri, we'll just out-innovate them. As long as they're stealing, they can't innovate. And I thought that was an incredibly condescending remark, one that dramatically underestimated the adversary, because of course you can steal and innovate. Of course, stealing allows you to take paths that you know will work, and abandon those that have much less of a chance to work based on research of others, and then invest in your own innovation. And that's what you're seeing now, where China is dominant in areas like electric vehicles and batteries and telecommunications equipment, which is objectively better than competitors. A lot of it was initially powered by theft, but then they've improved upon it as you would expect. So that is the challenge that you're facing now.
100% support where you came from that. I had early career years in semiconductor equipment, and I know quite well about intellectual property theft. Witnessed, noticed rewards for engineers of that country for stealing basically intellectual property that we owned, and high five themselves. Kind of not a fair playing field when you consider, we have patents and copyrights and trademarks here, and none of that means anything in the world of theft.
No, that's absolutely right. They have no compulsion to steal. The only thing from their perspective that matters is winning, which I can certainly appreciate. And I don't actually fault them for doing this, right? They're pursuing their national security objectives, as one would expect. I fault us for letting them do it and get away with it.
Valid point. Coming into artificial intelligence, which is very significant to John's life and my life here, in enablement. I'm quite aware of the advancements on their side, the large volume of patents filed from Chinese engineers over here. What advice would you give to our political leaders today to move forward and make sure we still have a relevance point here?
Well, this is where you have some bright spots in this competition, because a few years ago, we finally woke up, particularly in the area of artificial intelligence, that this is not an area you can let China win, not just because of the economic implications of dominance in the sector, but also because of its direct impact on military technologies. And as a result, the Biden administration started a series of export controls, first on equipment that's needed to produce advanced chips, which is manufactured for all intents and purposes in basically three countries: the United States, Netherlands, and Japan. And the United States has an incredible weapon in its arsenal called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which is wielded by the Commerce Department, that basically says that if there is any product out there in the world that is manufactured with basically around 20% of US IP or US content or US component parts, then we have a right to regulate its export anywhere else in the world, right? So you can literally produce a widget on Mars, but if it has 20% of content, it can't go anywhere where we don't want it to go. And that's essentially what we've done, is use this foreign product direct rule to restrict export of semiconductors to Russia, because every chip in the world is actually made either with US technology or US equipment. And as a result, we basically instituted a blanket ban on import of export of chips into Russia. Now, there are evasions, there's black markets that are taking place, but in terms of large companies trying to sell into Russia, they're all banned. So we threatened to use that rule with our allies on China. And as a result, we've gotten a lot of these allies, actually all of these allies, to come on board and restrict advanced equipment from going into China, which is dramatically curtailing their ability to produce advanced chips, those effectively below 18 nanometers. And then on top of that, we said, and by the way, we will not let you import advanced GPUs from companies like NVIDIA and AMD that you need to train your own AI models. And that has dramatically curtailed their advancements in this sector. They're behind, and they're falling further and further behind because, of course, the one necessary component of training foundation AI, frontier AI models is chips, right? And access to
Mhm.
chips, access to compute in huge quantities. And yes, they're still able to buy some GPUs on the black market and import a few tens of thousands of them every year. But that's just not sufficient, particularly for a country as large as China, to be able to catch up to the likes of OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and Meta and so forth. And that's what you're seeing now is that we are establishing a leadership position in that space by basically kneecapping China.
Interesting. Kind of building on that, then obviously taking the political route that we're kind of connecting between the relationship between China, the U.S. Even Russia obviously has a play in there somewhere. But thinking obviously as we are coming up upon a very critical general election in the US. And admittedly, I'm not completely knowledgeable about either candidate's stance on how to proliferate AI development within the US or safeguards or exactly what their stance is. What do you think are the implications for this economic war, specifically in the terms of AI development between the US and China, from either perspective? If Kamala Harris gets elected president or if Donald Trump gets elected president, what do you see the AI landscape between our two countries, or how that evolves, or how do you see that evolving depending on who gets elected?
I think it'll actually be very similar. In fact, the one continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration has been the China policy, right? The Biden administration kept virtually all the tariffs actually all the tariffs that Trump instituted on China in place, increased some of them, had done more on export controls. I think the Trump administration, should it come into office again, will basically be a continuation of that and further ratcheting it up those measures. I think Kamala Harris, who has spoken quite starkly about the need to win this race vis-a-vis China. In fact, basically quoting the title of my book, is going to do largely the same thing. There might be differences in some technical details and how you approach allies, whether you threaten them or whether you try to bring them on board voluntarily. But I think by and large, they will try to pursue the same objectives. The interesting piece here is actually not what we're going to do vis-a-vis China, because I don't think there's going to be any relaxations on controls on equipment or chips going into China. But what happens with other countries? Because one of the ways in which China is now trying to evade those really significant controls is by leveraging compute capacity elsewhere around the world, right? So if, for example, we allow UAE to build massive data centers of NVIDIA chips in their country, and then Chinese companies are able to access that compute and train their own models, that's basically a backdoor around the export controls, right? Now, the Biden administration has worked hard to try to get the UAE to pull them away from China, where they have very close relationships as they do with us, and to try to do more around vetting of customers of cloud compute environments and so forth. And it'll be interesting to see if the Trump administration pursues similar measures with allies as they would be vis-a-vis directly with China.
Interesting. Um, Kind of a follow-up on that, thinking more of the global landscape then for AI. So one of the things that has happened fairly recently this year, maybe even within the past 4 or 5 months, is several large tech companies from the US and also China have basically kind of swarmed into Southeast Asia, with a lot of them pledging millions or billions of dollars in investment in data centers. I think Google, Apple, Amazon, Intel, a lot of these big tech companies from the US and some from China have all kind of moved into the Southeast Asia region with lots of money and lots of investment, which has been obviously a boon for those countries. But I'm interested in your take on how you think that impacts the relationship between the U.S. and China and AI, because it almost, in my opinion, that it's as if China and the U.S. still want to or still feel the need to work together or work economically together, but they can't actually do it because of all the sanctions between each of our countries. So they kind of act as this proxy, the proxy region in Southeast Asia, where they can all still kind of work together but separately, if that makes any sense. What are your
Yeah.
take on kind of that development in that part of the world?
Yeah, I don't think this is about working together. I think this is about trying to lock in potential friends and partners before the other side does, right? So this is really a
Mhm.
competition for winning that region and trying to get it closer to our side versus their side. And again, this is exactly the same thing that happened in the Cold War, where you had a huge non-aligned bloc that everyone was vying for and trying to pull closer to either the Soviet Union side or the U.S. side. It's playing out yet again, particularly in the technology space. In AI, there's an interesting juxtaposition of national security priorities. On one hand, this technology that I think everyone agrees will be incredibly economically empowering and will drive productivity growth and so much innovation in the coming decades, can be a huge chip for us to use in our foreign policy, right? To enable other countries to develop economically, to create advanced capabilities. There's also a win-win situation that is seen where energy costs in the United States, of course, are quite significant. So if you can go to other countries where the price of energy is low and you can build large data centers, then
Mhm.
you can train these models and run inference on them at a much lower cost. So they benefit and we benefit as well. But then there's the other side of this coin, which is that if you believe that AI will be as transformative as many smart people focused on this believe, not just economically, but in terms of integration of those capabilities and particularly autonomy into military systems. And I don't want to overstate the case, but some have likened it to the development of nuclear weapons, not necessarily from a destructive of the planet perspective, but in terms of really changing everything once this technology is developed and changing the entire nature of international relations as occurred after the development of the atomic bomb. That why wouldn't you want, and the fact that all of this technology is basically in the United States and is fully controlled by the United States, right? All the top 5 companies that are producing frontier models are American companies. All of the chips that you use for training and inference are being designed by American companies. They're being produced by TSMC, but nevertheless an ally. And so much of the cutting edge research is happening largely in the United States and a few other allied countries. So if you have such dominance in this field, there's an actual question of, well, do you want to try to control it as much as possible? And particularly because it requires so much investment in terms of capital investment that it's hard for most other countries to compete, except those
Mhm.
that have the money to invest billions of dollars in training this. So you have this natural tension that is being fought about in the national security apparatus of, do you use it as a way to pull others closer to us, or is it so fundamentally revolutionary, particularly in the military sphere, that you want to try to control it as much as possible? Now, you won't be able to do it forever, but even if you get a decade or two out of it, that can be very significant.
Dmitri, that's very insightful. And when we consider like some of the softer sides of influence, it's apparent that China, even within your book, I think there's a mention, there's a softer side potentially where China might be going after the media and other areas of influence. And we have our own challenges here in the U.S. and we have polarization between the media is one way or the other way, and people call things fake news. How do you perceive the presence of China in media coming forward?
Well, obviously, we've had this debate over last year around TikTok. And I actually think that the framing of that debate was very misguided, because fundamentally it is not about privacy and your data going to China, because the reality is your data is already going everywhere else. Even with American companies, they're happy to sell it to anyone who is willing to pay a buck for it. But the fundamental problem is that TikTok is a media company. Now, it is user-generated content, but nevertheless, there's an algorithm and human moderators, which people tend to forget about, that dictate what you can see, and by the way, what you can't see, right? Things disappear off TikTok all the time, and no one knows why, in terms of things that may not be politically approved by the Chinese Communist Party. So for me, the TikTok debate was about influence, and TikTok, self-admittedly, is used by half of the American population, 150 million people, and allowing a foreign control company to have that level of influence in this country when you're in a Cold War with that country seems kind of ridiculous, right? Imagine if Pravda, the main newspaper of the Soviet Union, had the circulation of the New York Times in the United States during the first Cold War. Would never allow that to happen, right? And in fact, we have rules on foreign media ownership in this country that have existed for many, many decades. One most prominent example of this is when Rupert Murdoch, as an Australian citizen at the time, was trying to buy the Fox network, not Fox News, but the actual network. In the 1980s, he was prevented from doing so until he became an American citizen, because even though he was a citizen of an allied country, we weren't going to let him do it. So you apply the same standard to TikTok, and you sort of say, well, wait a second, this is a company that's owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance. There's CCP influence and control by law of the technology sector in China. They self-admittedly say that they have enormous influence over the United States, which they've demonstrated, by the way, when they had this campaign, which horribly backfired when Congress was considering the TikTok Divestiture Act to have people call their congressmen, which they did in enormous numbers, to try to protest this. Why would you let a foreign company have that much influence over this country?
Very good, Dmitri. I know we're going to wrap up here, but if I had to give our audience one or two key takeaways, besides going out and purchasing your book, World on the Brink, help us out with some key takeaways for our audience.
Well, the key takeaway is we are in a Cold War. We didn't have time to dig into why, but I outlined that this Cold War has existed for a long time. We've just not paid attention to it. We've now woken up. And the key to winning this Cold War is making sure it doesn't get into a hot war over Taiwan, but also winning the technology competition in this race for the 21st century. I believe the 4 critical technologies that will define the winners of the century are AI and autonomy, biotech and synthetic biology, space technology, and green energy. And the 2 components without which you can't build any of those technologies are semiconductors and critical minerals. Whoever wins the race and dominates in all those sectors, the 4 technologies and the 2 components, will win the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Dmitri. On behalf of the Unriveted crew, we enjoyed having you on. I know John and I could talk with you for hours, but our time frame is up. And I just want to say thank you for being on Unriveted.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks all.